My family laughed when I started selling coffee from a tiny truck. They called it embarrassing. 5 years later, they all showed up at my new restaurant opening. They still didn't know why I had reserved the biggest table in the room for them. And honestly, if you had seen the way they treated me when I first started, you would understand why I didn't tell them what that table was really for. My name is Olivia Carter. I'm 34 now, but I was 29 when I bought that truck. At the time, I was living in a small apartment, working a job I hated, and carrying around an idea I'd been too afraid to take seriously. A coffee business, not a cafe, not some fancy chain. A tiny mobile coffee truck that I could park near office buildings, construction sites, college campuses, and anywhere else people needed caffeine before 9 in the morning. I knew it sounded small. That was exactly why my family thought it was ridiculous. My dad was the first one to laugh. We were sitting around my parents' kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon when I told them I'd signed the paperwork. My mom stopped cutting her pie. My older brother Mark looked at me like I just announced I was joining a circus. Dad leaned back in his chair. "You bought a truck?" "Yeah." "For coffee?" "That's the idea." He laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real laugh. The kind where someone doesn't even try to hide that they think you're being stupid. Mark joined in. "Wait, you're serious?" "Very. You're going to drive around selling coffee?" "I'll have a fixed route." Mom finally spoke. "Olivia, honey, that's not really a career." I remember looking down at my hands. "I know." Dad shook his head. "You have a college degree." "I know." "You've worked in management." "I know." "You could apply for a real job." That sentence stayed with me. A real job. I didn't argue. I just said, "I want to try this." Dad sighed. "You always had trouble knowing when to grow up." Everyone went quiet. I smiled because I didn't know what else to do. That night, I went back to my apartment and sat on the floor surrounded by paperwork. For the first time, I wondered if they were right. Maybe I was being irresponsible. Maybe I was throwing away years of education. Maybe a coffee truck really was embarrassing. Then, I looked at the numbers. The startup cost was manageable. The margins could work. There was a growing office district about 15 minutes from my apartment with almost no independent coffee options. I had a plan. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was mine, so I kept going. The truck itself was nothing special. It was an old white step van I'd bought from a local seller. There were dents along one side. The back door stuck when it was cold. The espresso machine was used. The refrigerator made an awful buzzing noise. I spent almost every dollar I had saved getting it ready. I painted the outside myself, badly. The first version of my logo looked like something I'd made in a free design program at 2 in the morning. My friend Kevin looked at it and said, "It's ugly." I laughed. "I know, but it's yours." That mattered. I named the truck Morning Mile Coffee. My plan was simple. Good coffee, fast service, friendly customers, no complicated menu. I woke up at 3:45 every morning. At first I barely sold anything. By first Monday I made 12 drinks. 12. My second day was worse. 9. I spent more money on gas than I made in sales. One morning rain came down so hard that nobody wanted to walk from the parking lot. I stood inside the truck listening to water hammer the roof. I had sold 7 cups. 7. I called my mom that afternoon. She asked how business was. "It's going okay." She laughed softly. "Are you sure you don't want to come back to the company?" My dad had an opening in his office. Nothing glamorous, but it was stable. I said no. She sighed. "Okay, honey." I could hear the disappointment. That hurt more than the laughter. But the next morning, I got up at 3:45 again. I kept showing up. That became my entire strategy. Show up, even when it rained. Show up when the wind was freezing. Show up when nobody came. Show up when I was exhausted. Show up when my bank account made me nervous. Then something small happened. A construction crew started parking near my usual location. One of the guys ordered a black coffee. The next day, he came back with 3 coworkers. The day after that, there were 7 of them. A week later, the crew supervisor asked if I could have coffee ready for 20 people at 6:30 every morning. I almost said yes before he finished the sentence. That one order changed my week. Then another company called, then a dental office, then a small law firm. I started getting repeat customers. People began remembering my name. One woman came every morning and ordered the same drink. After a few weeks, she brought her daughter. "My daughter says you're the coffee truck girl." I laughed. "That's me." She smiled. "You're becoming famous." I wasn't, not even close. But it felt good. I started improving everything. I learned which beans worked best. I changed suppliers. I tracked every expense. I stopped wasting milk. I figured out which locations were profitable and which ones weren't. I learned that the difference between making money and losing money could be something as simple as where I parked. And slowly the numbers changed. Instead of losing money every week, I started breaking even. Then I made a profit. Then I made enough to pay myself. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I thought my family might finally take me seriously. They didn't. At Thanksgiving, my brother asked how the little coffee cart was doing. "Truck," I corrected. "Whatever." Everyone laughed. Dad raised his glass. "To Olivia," he said, still chasing her little dream. More laughter. I smiled. "Thanks, Dad." He looked pleased with himself. I didn't tell him I'd made more money that month than I had made at my old job. Not because I wanted to embarrass him, because I was beginning to understand something. My family didn't want me to succeed. They wanted me to become the version of me they had already decided was acceptable. And my truck didn't fit that picture. The following spring, things changed again. A local business posted a video of my truck on social media. The video showed me making drinks during a busy morning. It wasn't professionally filmed. It wasn't some huge marketing campaign. It was just a customer saying, "If you're in town, you have to try this place." The video got shared, then shared again. By the end of the week, I had hundreds of new customers. I ran out of cups one morning. I ran out of milk the next. I had to call Kevin at 6 in the morning and ask him to bring emergency supplies. He showed up laughing. "You're a disaster." "I know. Congratulations." That was the first time I realized the business might actually become something. Within a year, I had a second truck. Then a third. I hired employees. I stopped doing every single shift myself. But I never stopped working. I still opened the first truck several mornings a week. I wanted to remember what it felt like, the cold, the early mornings, the first customer, the empty parking lot, the feeling of wondering whether anybody would show up. My family noticed the growth. Their attitude changed, not toward me, toward the business. Dad started asking questions. "How much revenue are you doing? How many trucks? What are your margins?" I answered honestly. He nodded. "Not bad, not bad." After everything, that was all he had. My brother eventually asked if I was interested in selling. I laughed. "Selling what?" "The company." "No. You could make a nice amount." "I'm not interested." He shrugged. "Just asking." But I knew. For years, they'd treated the business like a joke. Now they were curious because it had value. That difference bothered me. Still, I kept building. 2 years after I bought the first truck, I had 5. 3 years later, 7. I started supplying beans to local businesses. Then I began roasting under my own label. That's when I started thinking about something bigger. A restaurant, not just coffee, breakfast, lunch, pastries, a place where people could sit, work, meet friends, bring their kids. A real neighborhood restaurant built around the same thing that had started in that dented white truck. Coffee. The problem was money. A restaurant required much more than a truck. Lease, construction, equipment, permits, staff, insurance, inventory, and rent during months when you weren't making enough to cover it. I nearly abandoned the idea twice. Then I found an old storefront. It had been vacant for almost 2 years. The location was excellent. The building needed work, a lot of work. I stood inside one afternoon looking at the cracked floor and exposed wiring. Kevin looked around. "You're crazy." "Probably. You really want this?" I looked through the front windows at the street. "Yes." So I signed the lease. That was the biggest financial decision I'd ever made. And the scariest. I put nearly everything back into the project. For 8 months, my life became construction meetings, permits, equipment deliveries, invoices, hiring interviews, and endless problems. The espresso machine arrived damaged. The plumbing had to be redone. One contractor disappeared halfway through the job. I spent a month dealing with an unexpected electrical issue. There were nights I sat alone in the unfinished dining room wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Then one night I called my dad. He asked how the restaurant was going. Slowly, he laughed. Be careful, Olivia. Don't let one successful truck convince you that you're a restaurateur. I stared at the empty dining room. Thanks for the advice. I'm serious. I know. He didn't ask if I needed help. I didn't ask. I had learned how to build things without waiting for approval. 5 years after that first morning, the restaurant was ready. I called it Mile and Bean, the same name I'd eventually put on all the coffee bags. The opening night was going to be invite only. Local customers, employees, business partners, people who had supported me, and then 3 days before opening, I sent invitations to my family. My mom, my dad, my brother, his wife, my aunt, my cousins, all of them. Kevin asked me why. You sure about this? Yeah. You know they're going to act like they've supported you from day one. I know. And you're still inviting them? I nodded. Everyone should have a seat at the table. Kevin looked at me. Which table? I smiled. The biggest one. He didn't understand. Not yet. The restaurant was beautiful. Not because it was enormous. It wasn't. It had warm wood tables, large windows, hanging lights, a long coffee bar, and shelves filled with bags of our roasted beans. The walls had photographs of the original truck. I had framed the very first menu. 12 drinks, a handwritten price list, my original logo, the ugly one. I kept it because it reminded me of where everything started. Opening night arrived. At 5:30, the doors opened. Customers came in. Employees moved behind the bar. The room filled with conversation. For the first time, I stood in the middle of the restaurant and watched people drink coffee I'd built a company around. I had to step into the kitchen for a minute because my eyes started watering. Not because I was sad, because I remembered the truck. That stupid old white truck. The one my family had laughed at. The one I'd nearly sold during my first winter. The one that had kept me going when I had no idea whether any of this would work. Then I heard my mother's voice. Olivia? I turned. My family had arrived, all of them. My dad wore a suit. My brother had brought his wife. My mom looked around with wide eyes. Wow. Dad slowly nodded. This is impressive. I smiled. Thanks. He looked toward the bar. You did all this? I had help. My mother hugged me. I'm not going to lie. That moment was complicated. Part of me wanted to hold on. Another part remembered every Sunday lunch, every joke, every time they called my business embarrassing, every time Dad told me to get a real job. She stepped back. We're so proud of you. I smiled. Thank you. Then my brother walked in. He looked around. Man, he whistled. This place is actually nice. Actually, he laughed. You know what I mean. I did. My dad looked at the dining room. Then he saw the largest table. It was near the center of the restaurant, long enough for 12 people, beautifully set. Every seat had a name card, my family's names. My mother stopped. Olivia? I nodded toward it. That table is yours. Dad smiled. You reserved the whole thing? Yes. He looked pleased. I could see the old confidence returning. The same expression he'd worn at Thanksgiving when he joked about my coffee truck. Only now there was something different behind it. He thought I'd finally become successful enough to impress him. He didn't know. That wasn't why I'd reserved the table. My family sat down. They looked around at the restaurant. My brother took pictures. My mother complimented the food. My aunt started talking about how she'd always known I had a good business sense. I listened. I didn't correct anyone. Then my father raised his glass. To Olivia, he said. Everyone looked at me. He smiled. Looks like that little coffee truck worked out after all. A few people laughed. I smiled. Looks like it. Then Dad leaned back. So what's next? I looked at him. That's a good question. He didn't know what was coming. Nobody did. The restaurant lights dimmed slightly. The room grew quieter. I walked toward the family table. In my hand was a folder, not thick, just a few pages. My mother looked at it. "What is that?" I put the folder down in front of my father. He looked at me. "What are you doing?" I smiled. "Remember when you told me that my coffee truck was embarrassing?" His smile disappeared. "Yes. You were right about one thing." He waited. It was small. I opened the folder. My family leaned closer. "But you were wrong about what small meant." Nobody spoke. I slid the first document across the table. My father looked down. Then his face changed. My brother stopped smiling. My mother covered her mouth. And I finally realized they understood why I had given them the biggest table in the restaurant. It wasn't a thank you. It wasn't forgiveness. And it definitely wasn't a celebration. It was the one place in the entire building where they were going to have to sit together and listen to what I had kept to myself for 5 years. I looked at my father. "There's something you all need to know about the company you laughed at." And then I turned the next page toward him. The page was a copy of the very first profit and loss statement I'd ever made for Morning Mile Coffee. At the top was the date, 5 years earlier. Underneath it, in my own handwriting, were the numbers from my first month. Revenue, $1,846. Expenses, $2,317. Net loss, $471. My dad stared at it. Then he looked at me. "What is this?" I took a breath. "My first month." He frowned. "I don't understand." "You said my business was embarrassing." He shifted in his chair. "I remember. You said I was wasting my education. You said I didn't know when to grow up." Nobody laughed this time. I reached into the folder and pulled out another page. "This is from the following year." I put it beside the first. Then another. And another. Month after month. Year after year. The numbers changed. The losses disappeared. The profits grew. The trucks multiplied. The company expanded. And eventually the numbers at the bottom became numbers my 29-year-old self would have thought were impossible. My brother leaned forward. "Wait." He looked at the pages again. "You actually did all this?" I looked at him. "Yes." My mother was staring at the documents. I could tell she was trying to remember all the times she'd asked me whether I had found a real job yet. My dad picked up the first page again. His fingers moved slowly across the handwritten figures. "You kept these?" "Of course." "Why?" I smiled. "Because I needed to remember." He looked confused. "Remember what?" "What it felt like when I had almost nothing." The table went quiet. I hadn't planned on making them feel ashamed. At least not exactly. I wanted them to understand. There was a difference. I had spent 5 years learning that success wasn't just about money. It was about proving to yourself that the voice in your own head could become louder than everyone else's. My father put the paper down. "So this is why you invited us?" "Partly." My brother looked at me. "What do you mean?" I closed the folder. "I wanted you all to sit at the biggest table in the restaurant because this is the first place I've ever built where I didn't feel like I had to apologize for what I was doing." My mom's eyes filled with tears. "Olivia." I shook my head gently. "Let me finish." She nodded. I looked around the table. "When I started that truck, none of you believed in me." My aunt looked down. My brother shifted in his chair. Dad said nothing. "You didn't just think I would fail. You made me feel embarrassed for trying." Dad finally spoke. "I never wanted you to feel embarrassed." I looked at him. "You laughed at me." He swallowed. "I was worried." "Then why didn't you say you were worried?" He didn't answer. I continued. "You could have said, 'I'm scared you're going to lose your savings.' You could have said, 'I'm not sure this is a good idea.' You could have asked me what my plan was." I paused. "But you didn't." Dad looked down. "You told me to get a real job." I was wrong. The words were so quiet that for a second I wasn't sure I'd heard him. "What?" He looked at me. I was wrong. It was the first time I'd ever heard my father say those words to me. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. 5 years of tension doesn't disappear because someone finally admits they're wrong. I sat down across from him. "Do you know what hurt the most?" He shook his head. You stopped asking how I was doing. Dad looked at me. You'd ask about the business. You'd ask about revenue. You'd ask how many trucks I had. I gave a small laugh. But you never ask whether I was okay. My mother wiped her cheek. I didn't realize. I know. That was the problem. They hadn't realized. Because they hadn't been paying attention to me. They had been paying attention to whether I was succeeding. My brother cleared his throat. I was jealous. But please sounds stupid. It doesn't. He looked at me. You were doing something. You were taking a risk. I was sitting at a desk complaining about my job. He laughed nervously. So it was easier to make fun of you. I nodded. That I understand. Do you forgive me? I thought about it. I don't know yet. He nodded. That answer seemed to surprise him. But I wanted to be honest. I wasn't going to hand out forgiveness just because it made everyone feel better. Then my dad asked the question I knew was coming. So what exactly did you expect tonight? I looked at him. Nothing. He frowned. Nothing? I didn't invite you here to ask for an apology. Then why? I looked around the restaurant. At the employees. At the customers. At the coffee bar. At the framed photograph of the old truck hanging on the wall. Because 5 years ago, you all made me feel like I had to hide this part of my life. I pointed toward the photograph. I don't hide it anymore. My mother looked at the picture. The old truck was covered in dents, the paint was uneven, the original Morning Mile logo was crooked. But I loved that photograph. Because that truck had carried me through the hardest year of my life, I stood up. Come with me! My family followed me from the table. I led them toward the back hallway. There was a framed photograph there that most customers didn't notice. It was a picture of me standing beside the truck on my first morning. I looked exhausted. My hair was pulled back. I was wearing an old sweatshirt. I had a paper cup in one hand and a ridiculous smile on my face. My dad stopped. You look happy. I was terrified. He smiled slightly. You don't look terrified. That's because I didn't want anyone to know. We stood there quietly. Then I told them something I'd never said before. The first morning I opened, I almost turned around. My mother looked at me. Why? Because I kept hearing your voices in my head. She looked hurt. I continued. I kept thinking, what if they're right? My dad's expression changed. And then one guy bought a coffee. I smiled. One guy. I looked at the photograph. He came back the next day. Then another customer. Then another. That's how it started. I walked back toward the dining room. And that's why this restaurant exists. The opening night continued around us. People were eating, laughing, taking pictures, talking to employees. Nobody knew what had just happened at our table. And honestly, I preferred it that way. I didn't want a public scene. I didn't want to embarrass my family in front of strangers. I'd spent 5 years learning that humiliation wasn't strength. Building something was. After dinner, my dad asked if we could talk privately. I nodded. We stepped outside. The parking lot was quiet. He stood beside me for a moment. Then he said, I'm proud of you. I looked at him. Thank you. I mean it. I believe you. He looked surprised. Do you? Yes. He exhaled. I should have said it years ago. Yes. He looked at the restaurant. I thought you were throwing your life away. I know. I was afraid you'd fail. I know. And I didn't know how to tell you that without making you feel small. I smiled sadly. So you made me feel small. He nodded. I did. There was nothing else to say. For once he didn't defend himself. He didn't make excuses. He just admitted it. And somehow, that meant more than a dramatic apology would have. Then he asked something unexpected. Do you still have the truck? I laughed. Of course. Where? Behind the warehouse. He smiled. Can I see it? I hesitated, then I nodded. The next morning, I drove him there. The original truck was still mine. I couldn't bring myself to sell it. It wasn't operational anymore, but I'd kept it as a reminder. Dad walked around it slowly. He touched the side where the first logo was still faintly visible. This thing really started everything. Yeah, he smiled. I thought it was a terrible idea. I laughed. I remember. He looked at me. I was wrong. This time, I believed him. A few weeks after the restaurant opened, something happened that surprised me even more. My mom asked if she could work one Saturday morning. Not as an employee, she just wanted to see what it was like. I said yes. She came in at 6:30. I gave her an apron. She stood behind the counter beside one of my managers. For the first hour, she mostly watched. Then a customer ordered a latte. My mom looked at me. How do you do this? I laughed. You press this. She laughed. I have no idea what I'm doing. Neither did I 5 years ago. She looked at me. I remember. She stayed until noon. At the end of the shift, she hugged me. You are really doing this every day? Pretty much. She shook her head. I had no idea how hard it was. I didn't say anything. She didn't need me to. Over the next year, my relationship with my family changed. Not magically, not overnight, but gradually. My dad stopped asking how much money the restaurant made. Instead, he'd ask, "How are you?" That small question meant more to me than he probably realized. My brother started helping with the business when I needed someone to look over contracts. He wasn't an employee. He just became someone I could call, and my mother became one of the restaurant's regular customers. Every Friday morning, she'd sit at the same table near the window. Sometimes we'd talk. Sometimes we'd just drink coffee. We never pretended the past didn't happen. That mattered. Because pretending would have been easier, but it wouldn't have been honest. A few months after the opening, my father asked me something else. Why did you put those numbers in the folder? I smiled. Because I wanted you to see the whole story. He nodded. Not just the final number. Exactly. I wanted them to understand that the restaurant wasn't the story. The restaurant was the result. The story was every morning before it, every failed week, every cheap cup, every customer who didn't show up, every time I went home smelling like coffee and rain, every time I wondered whether I was making a terrible mistake. The story was the woman standing inside that little truck who had no idea what her life would look like 5 years later. One evening, about 6 months after the restaurant opened, I was closing up. I walked into the dining room after everyone had left. The lights were low, the chairs were empty, the biggest table was still there, the same table I'd reserved for my family on opening night. I stood beside it for a long time. Then I remembered my father's words from years earlier. Get a real job. I laughed quietly. Not because I was angry, because I finally understood something. He had been measuring success by the size of the thing. The truck was small, the restaurant was bigger. But that wasn't what mattered. The truck had given me something the restaurant never could. Proof. Proof that I could start with almost nothing and keep going. Proof that I didn't need everyone to believe in me. Proof that being underestimated wasn't the end of the story. Sometimes it was the beginning. I still have the original truck. It's parked behind the building now. The paint is faded. The refrigerator doesn't work. The driver's seat is cracked, but I won't sell it. People sometimes ask why I keep an old truck when I own a successful restaurant. I usually just smile, because they see an old vehicle. I see the first version of myself, who decided she was worth betting on. And as for my family, things aren't perfect. I don't think they ever will be. Some wounds don't disappear just because people apologize. But I don't carry the anger the way I used to. I don't need them to feel guilty every time they walk into my restaurant. I don't need them to tell me I was right. I don't need them to admit they were wrong. They already know. That's enough. A year after the opening, my father came in one morning. He sat at the biggest table, alone. I walked over. You okay? He smiled. Yeah. Then he looked around. You know something? What? I used to think this place was proof that I was wrong about the business. I waited. He looked at me. Now I think it's proof that I was wrong about you. That hit differently. I sat down across from him. Thank you. He nodded. Then he pointed toward the old photograph on the wall. You should keep that there. I plan to. Good. We sat quietly for a minute. Then he asked, Can I get a coffee? I smiled. Of course. What do you recommend? I laughed. You're asking me? He smiled. I'm learning. I went behind the counter and made his coffee myself. And as I handed it to him, I realized something. The revenge I had imagined years ago had never actually been about making my family hurt. It had been about making sure their opinion no longer had the power to hurt me. That was the difference. I didn't need to destroy anyone. I didn't need to humiliate them. I didn't need to prove that I was better than them. I just needed to become the person I'd been too afraid to become when they laughed at me. The person who took the risk. The person who failed and kept going. The person who didn't quit because somebody else thought the dream was too small. And that night, when I locked the restaurant and walked past the framed photograph of that old coffee truck one last time, I stopped. I looked at the woman in the picture, 29 years old, exhausted, terrified, holding a paper cup like it was something precious. She had no idea that 5 years later she'd be standing inside her own restaurant. She had no idea her family would someday sit at the biggest table in the room. She had no idea that the thing they called embarrassing would become the foundation of everything she built. But maybe that's the part I wish I'd understood back then. You don't need everyone to believe in your dream. Sometimes you just need enough courage to keep working when nobody does. My family laughed when I started with a tiny truck. 5 years later, they sat at the biggest table in my restaurant and watched me serve coffee to hundreds of people. But the biggest thing I gained wasn't the restaurant. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even proving them wrong. It was finally realizing that my life didn't need their approval to have value. The truck was never embarrassing. Giving up on myself would have been. And I didn't.